The idea for this talk came from, of all things, a spaghetti dinner. I was sitting home one weekend and my father-in-law called me and said that he was going to a fundraiser at Rockwell Automation, and he was taking his grandkids and he wanted to know if my family wanted to go. So we weren't doing anything. I said sure, so we went down there, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but one of the highlights for me at least of the fundraiser was getting to go up into the clock. And while I was up there, I thought, this would probably be a good topic for a club here. And it's not the oldest clock in the city, and it's not the most mechanically interesting clock in the city, but it's certainly the largest clock in the city. And we probably all drive by it at least once a week. And so I thought it'd be interesting to do a little bit of research on the clock. And it's also a good way to illustrate that no matter what clock we have in the city, that there's a ton of information out there on the clocks in our town. The internet, obviously everyone uses nowadays. I was able to go to the library and picked up this book on Alan Bradley. It was written by John Gerda. I think everyone's familiar with him. He's a historian here in town. And the clock itself is really an icon. I think that we featured it on our membership cards at one time. And yesterday I happened to be walking through the Wauwatosa Library and I came across this for UWM, and they've got the Alan Bradley clock on here as just part of their illustration. So it really is part of our culture. And so what I'm going to do today, hopefully if this works, is talk a little bit about the history of Alan Bradley, because really the history of the clock is interwoven with the history of the company. We'll talk about the clocks and mechanics and some of the fun facts about the clock. And then we'll talk a little bit about, we'll show some pictures about inside the tower. So the history of the clock really starts with two brothers, Lion Bradley and Harry Bradley. And they were born into a fairly prominent family in the city of Milwaukee. Their mother was Clara and their father was Henry. And Clara in particular came from a very well-to-do family. Her father was Pitt Line. He was one of the early settlers in the town. He bought a lot of land, and he was an attorney. And the law firm that he helped found eventually became Foley & Lardner, which is the oldest and largest law firm in the state of Wisconsin. And the family did fairly well. Henry was a businessman. He was in the paper industry. He dabbled in a silver mine out in Colorado. And the family was also had a bit of an entrepreneurial streak. Both the mother and the father had patents to their name, which I think is fascinating, particularly to see Clara have a patent, because at the time, women were even allowed to vote. So to me, it was interesting to find out that she was able to actually have patents. And unfortunately, around the early 1890s, the family fell upon hard times. Henry Bradley became sick, and they lost a lot of their fortune. While the family wasn't necessarily destitute, after Henry passed away, Clara ended up having to take boarders into their house to help them take ends meet. And so Harry and Lion Bradley really didn't start out inheriting anything or inheriting a business. And so they were pretty much on their own. And Lion Bradley in particular, he was very innovative. He was fascinated by electricity, which was a new technology in the day. And he actually ended up with a patent of his own at the age of 16. He invented an electronic weather vane, where he took the weather vane, he ran wires down to a series of magnets around the compass. And as the weather vane turned, it would indicate on the compass the direction of the wind. So he was, again, at a very young age, he was coming up with all kinds of new ideas. And in fact, the motor controller unit that he ended up developing and was really the cornerstone of the Alan Bradley company, he invented that around the age of 14 or 16 just by playing around with a toy lathe and some odd parts around the house. So, but he wasn't very good at school, like a lot of very intelligent individuals. So he ended up dropping out of school in 1897. He opened his own company, the Milwaukee X-ray Laboratory. This is another thing I thought was really interesting too, because those of you who have kids, you probably see them when they're younger. They cut grass, they shovel snow, they babysit for money. Here's a kid who goes out and he opens a business using X-rays. And again, this is a new technology of the day, just like electricity. Not a lot was known about, particularly the safety aspect of X-rays. And it was a new technology, and he marketed it to attorneys and physicians. And physicians in particular, obviously, were interested in it because of its potential for use in diagnosing illnesses and injuries. And one of his early clients was Dr. Stanton Allen. And this is the Allen part of Allen Bradley. And Dr. Allen was very impressed by the young Lion Bradley, and they ended up developing a very close relationship. And Dr. Allen eventually became really a mentor to the Bradley brothers and really served as a father figure in their lives after Henry Bradley passed away. And Lion Bradley's first love was really electricity. So in 1900, he closed up his X-ray business, which was probably good for his health. And he went to work for the Milwaukee Electric Company, basically being a service technician for electrical motors, electric cranes, those sorts of things. And at that time, this was when Milwaukee was really starting to earn its nickname as the machine shop to the world. And this is where, Harnischwager and Allis-Chalmers all got their name. So they all had these sorts of heavy equipment that needed control systems. And so he would go out and make service calls. And he noticed while he was doing these calls, the crane operators really had a difficult time in operating their equipment. And he realized that the control unit that he had been developing years earlier might have an application in this heavy equipment. And so in 1901, he quit his job and he went to work full-time trying to develop a workable prototype for his motor controller. And he needed money to help do that, and so he reached out to Dr. Allen. Dr. Allen invested $1,000 in exchange for a 50% share of the business, which is probably one of the all-time great investments of the time when you think about how big Allen Bradley is. And bear with me a second. He was able to develop a working controller by 1903, and they started their own company called the Compression Rheostat Company. Not really a name that flows off the tongue like Allen Bradley, but this was their first business where they were producing these. And they had some success early on in developing a controller that worked, but the problem was he was working in the corner of a machine shop, Pfeiffer and Smith, producing these really on his own. And so the cost per unit was really, really expensive. And he really needed to find someone that would be able to help him produce these on a larger scale. And through his family connections, he was able to meet up with an individual, his name was Frank Jones, who owned American Electric Fuse Company, based out of Chicago. And the two of them struck a deal where the Compression Rheostat Company would produce these units jointly with American Electric Fuse. And they moved down to Chicago to begin producing these. And then in 1906, American Electric Fuse built a brand new facility in Muskegon, Michigan. And so production moved there. And during all this, Harry Bradley joined the firm at the age of 19, again, really young age, to head up production for these control units. And one of the things that they found as they began to get these units into production and out into industry, they found that there was a fatal flaw within the controller. And basically what these controllers were, and if anyone has been to Discovery World, there's a whole big display on how these things operate. But basically they're a series of carbon discs in a metal tube. And when you compress those discs, it allows a current to flow. When you take off the pressure, the resistivity increases, and so you get less current. And that was the concept behind these control units. But what they found was, over time, these carbon discs were breaking down because of the heat and because of the heavy use that operators were placing on them. And so they needed to come up with a material that was more durable. And that was something that Harry Bradley worked on for a number of years, and he was able to come up with basically a graphite-type disc that was able to withstand the heat and also the operator's heavy hand in terms of using it to control the equipment that the operators were using. And so things were really looking up by 1906. The company had a partnership with someone who was able to produce these units. They had eliminated a potentially fatal flaw in their equipment, and things were looking very, very promising. Unfortunately for the Bradley brothers, Frank Jones was a bit of a crook. And eventually what ended up happening was he was caught in a massive fraud where he was creating fictitious companies, writing fictitious checks, and basically generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, which at that time was just an enormous sum of money. But back in 1906, the Bradleys were just getting an inkling that Frank Jones was not a very savory character. And they were getting paid later and later for work that they were doing for Frank Jones. And eventually the group had a falling out. And in 1909, the Bradleys finally quit American Electric Fuse and they moved back to Milwaukee. in 1910, and with Dr. Allen formed the Allen Bradley Company, which is the name that stuck around through 1985. Well, Frank Jones wasn't going to take this lying down, and so he began to file a lawsuit against the Bradley brothers. And Dr. Allen and the Bradleys hired a young attorney, Lewis Quarles, to work on the lawsuits and basically put that to rest and put that behind them. And the name probably sounds familiar because, again, that's another law firm that's really big in Milwaukee, Quarles and Brady. And so when the Bradley brothers moved back to Milwaukee, they moved back to the Pfeiffer and Smith machine shop over on 2nd Street, took up residence in the 3rd floor, and began production with support from the Pfeiffer and Smith staff. And again, they were kind of faced with the same problem they had before with trying to produce these units on a larger basis. But they really had a lot of help from the staff at Pfeiffer and Smith, and they began to produce these units in larger quantities. But it was kind of touch and go for the company for a number of years, but they began to slowly make market penetration and sell more of the controllers. But the event that really helped them out was World War I, because that's when the country was switched over to wartime production. You had more heavy industry, you had a lot more equipment that needed these sorts of control systems, and that was right in the Allen Bradley Company's wheelhouse. And so at that point their fortunes really began to change, and they began to become more and more successful. Around that time, Dr. Allen passes away, which was a really blow to the Bradleys because, as I said earlier, he was really a father figure to the Bradley boys. But they reorganized the company, and they made Lyon Bradley the president, Harry Bradley became the vice president, and Louis Quarles became the secretary. And the three of them together ran the company. And by the end of World War I, the company had been able to grow its business and reach sales of $400,000 a year. So they were finally on the path to consistent success. In 1923, they adopted the Octagon logo, which you see around town. If you look closely at the clock, you'll notice that that incorporates the logo. You can see the octagon shape of the dial. You drive around the building on 2nd Street, you can still see the logo there, even though it's now a different company. By 1944, the company was really producing two main lines of equipment. They were producing industrial controls and electrical components. And by 1985, the company had reached $1 billion in sales. And again, a $1,000 investment by Dr. Allen really paid off. In 1985, that was another big watershed event for the company, and that's when it was acquired by Rockwell International and was rolled into that. And that's unfortunately when we lost another local name within the Milwaukee community, Allen Bradley. In 2001, that unit was spun off and became Rockwell Automation, which is the company we know today. And that company is still very successful. They have over $4 billion in sales. They have 19,000 employees worldwide. And to me, it was a fun thing to learn because we always hear, through the media that America doesn't produce anything anymore. We're the manufacturing jobs. And it's good to see that there are still companies, particularly based in Milwaukee, that still are very successful doing what Milwaukee has always done, and that is making things. So anyway, that's enough about the Allen Bradley Company. I do want to stop for a moment and switch gears a little bit because I know I've had a couple people come up to me and mention that they work for Allen Bradley or they're familiar with the Allen Bradley Company through some of their friends. As I talk, if anyone wants to interject about the company or about the clocks, please feel free to do so. That's one of the nice things about doing research on a clock that's more current is that people are still alive that had something to do with it. So if you know anything about this as we're going along, or if you want to interject at the end, please do so. But anyway, getting back to the clocks, which is really kind of what we're interested in here. One of the things I was really amazed to learn as I was doing this research is that the clock that we see every day really wasn't the original clock in the clock tower. And I'm not from Milwaukee, I'm from Chicago originally, so maybe some of you older gentlemen here remember when this clock was the original clock, but this is something I thought was really interesting. And the original building complex on 2nd Street was designed by Fitzhugh Scott Jr. And the original clock was on the east side of 2nd Street, and it was completed in 1950. And the Milwaukee Sentinel at the time reported that it was the largest clock in the United States, and its dial was about 21 feet across, and the timing unit on it was constructed by IBM. And one of the interesting things about the article that was in the Journal Sentinel is it referred to the IBM company as the IMD company because it was this new upstart company at the time, I guess, and no one quite knew what it was called. So you can see the octagon shape in the dial there. And what happened was in the 1960s and 1970s, when the new clock was constructed and dedicated, they switched over the smaller clock to the temperature clock. And so when you drive by that and you see the temperature, that's where the original clock was located. And you can see that in the architectural drawing over here, which I also forgot to mention. These architectural drawings here are from the Wisconsin Architectural Archives at the Milwaukee Public Library. And again, one of the things is I've done a number of talks on local clocks, and one of the things I'm always amazed about is how much information is out there about the clocks in our town. And the Wisconsin Architectural Archives is a collection of architectural drawings of prominent buildings throughout the state of Wisconsin. And they're available from buildings from City Hall all the way up to Miller Park. And so it's a great resource if you're trying to find information about local buildings in the town. So anyway, that's the first clock. The second clock is on the west side of 2nd Street, and this is a clock we're all familiar with. During construction, it was hidden from view with scaffolding and tarps, and there was a grand dedication on Halloween of 1962. The building wasn't finished until 1964, but Harry Bradley, who was president of the company at the time, was in ill health, and he really wanted to be around for the dedication ceremony, and that's why it was moved up to 1962. And in fact, there was a little bit of a dust-up between the architect and Harry Bradley because the architect felt like this tower was just way too big. It was way out of proportion to the rest of the building. He really didn't like that at all. But Harry Bradley really wanted to make a statement. And so, owning the company, he had the final say in what it looked like. And again, the building was completed in 1964. Just a quick check of the bulletin on the NAWCC website. There's one brief article about the Allen Bradley clock, of course referring it to as the Polish moon, because of the fact that A, it's lit up, and B, at the time, that was a big Polish community. And again, not a whole lot of information about it in the bulletin, but there is one article in there about it. Just some fun facts about the clock. At one time, it was the largest four-sided clock in the world. It was listed in the Guinness World Book of Records as such. During its design, there was some talk about making it a chiming clock, but it was decided that they didn't want to add chimes to it because they wanted to allow Big Ben to continue to be the largest chiming clock in the world. And so they didn't construct it with chimes, and so Big Ben was able to maintain the status of the largest four-sided chiming clock in the world, and then the Allen Bradley clock became the largest four-sided clock in the world, which then unfortunately lost its title in 2010 to some clock out in Saudi Arabia. But still the largest four-sided clock in the Western Hemisphere, so I guess we can still say that. It's certainly the largest clock in Milwaukee. And this is a little fact sheet that Allen Bradley used to put out for the clock. You know, it shows it compared to the space shuttle, which Rockwell helped to construct. It shows them compared to Big Ben. And again, it's about 330 feet from the ground level all the way to the top of the flagpole. And the clock itself extends across the 14th, 15th, and 16th floors, with the mechanism being on the 15th floor. And you can see that it's really, not a whole lot to look at. When I went to visit the clock a couple weeks ago, the facilities manager took me up there. We got off an elevator, we walked down this hallway, he opened a door, and he says, "There's the clock." It's basically, the size of a refrigerator. This doesn't really show. But at the top, you can see a gray motor unit. Basically, there's two motors on this clock. One is a high-speed motor that's used to change the time, and it's capable of turning the minute hand once around in 30 seconds. And they use that to change time for daylight savings time and so forth. And then there's a lower speed clock that's used to regulate the time. And during its construction, Allen Bradley was able to get 2 patents for it, one of which was for the hands. You really think of the hands as being very important, but clearly by the lake, wind is a factor, and so they had to construct the hands out of aluminum. They had to shape them a specific way in order to give strength to them, but still have them be lightweight enough to be on the clock. So they got a patent for the construction of the hands, and they also got a patent for the mechanism as well. And this is a cross-section from the patent that shows the movement. You can see the motors at the top, and all the rest of it is just the gearing, and then the hands are off to the right. And another thing, not being from Milwaukee, and I drove by this clock every day and didn't really realize, is that there's an observation deck on top of the clock. So as you're driving by it and you look really closely, you can see a line of windows up there. And basically it's a lounge that the executives use for sale events and so forth. This tower is used a lot for the executive suite, so access is restricted above the 11th floor. But they do occasionally allow the observation deck to be used for fundraisers. And I'm told that when people retire, they're allowed to bring their family up for a photo opportunity. So it's used on occasion by employees as well. And this is a photo of the observation deck. You can see it's very, very nice. And this is where I was allowed to go during that spaghetti dinner I was telling you about at the beginning. They being Allen Bradley Company, did a fundraiser for the United Performing Art Funds. And I went in 2010. I think they do this every year. And I have to say it was probably one of the best fundraisers I ever went to. They had their cafeteria open and they had food. They had clowns and magicians for kids. They had raffles. My son actually won this Lego robotics set that he still plays with, and he's part of the Lego robotics team in his school. So, by going to this event, it kind of helps set him on a path to, who knows what he's going to do someday. But again, it was just a great, great event. And one of the things they let us do is go up in the observation deck. And we weren't able to see the mechanism at all, unfortunately. I had to make another arrangement a couple weeks ago to do that. They just took us up to the deck. But it was a great time and it was a great view. One of the things I also want to mention, just in closing, because it happens to be this weekend is the Doors Open Milwaukee event. Has anyone here ever been to any of the events for Doors Open? I know you guys have. It's a fabulous event. It was yesterday and it's today, and I think it runs till 4 o'clock. And basically what it is about 50 buildings in the city open their doors to the general public. You get to go behind the scenes in buildings that you never see the inside of. And there are buildings like the Northwestern Mutual Life building's open. A couple years ago, my son and I went up to the top of the U.S. Bank building, the tallest building in the city, to look out over the city. Last year, I know you guys went, I went to there. Do you know the name of that church on Fleet Street? That had there's a church on Fleet Street, and they let us go up in the clock tower. And we could see their Matthias Schwalbach clock movement. So it's a really, really neat event. Pardon? It's based at City Hall. City Hall's there. You can take tours of City Hall, go up and see the bell. So if you got some time this afternoon, check it out. Just Google Doors Open Milwaukee. You'll see the schedule. You'll see the buildings. What is? Oh yeah, you're right. Allen Bradley's not on the schedule though. So thank you. It's not right. I was talking to the facility manager. Last year they had 3,000 people go through the clock. And as it turns out, it's serviced by one elevator. That manufacturer no longer exists. And they basically have a full-time person on their staff. His only job is to maintain that elevator. And so until they are able to construct a new elevator, they're trying to really limit the use of the elevator so it doesn't break down. So this year it's not open, but hopefully in later years it will be. But there's tons of other buildings that are open today. So I encourage you to go check it out because there's some neat things you can go see. The Grain Exchange building, all kinds of neat stuff.
I think they said there was 130 buildings.
Is there that many this year? I mean, I think it's their 3rd year they've been doing this, and every year, the buildings add and drop off, and but again, it's really neat to be able to go through some of these buildings, churches, other public buildings that you just don't really get a chance to see.
Control room, drawbridge.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the drawbridge control. Yeah, there's some neat things you get to see. So anyway, I just want to close with a few photos from the observation deck. This is obviously the lake and the Holm Bridge. This is looking west. You can see Miller Park way in the distance. And I'm told that on a really clear day, you can see Holy Hill from the top of the clock. And then this is the downtown area. So in closing, I just want to close with a thanks to the facility engineer, Stephen Strotz, who gave me a tour of the clock movement and the observation deck a couple weeks ago and let me take some pictures. And I really appreciate that. And with that, I'd like to close with give you a chance to ask questions, and more importantly, if you have knowledge of the clock you want to share with the group, please do so. So thank you. Yes?
The early 80s, I went through the clock with the SE, Society of Automobile Engineers group, and the guy was pointing out holes in the north dial, full of holes. And I never figured out how he got that.
Wow. A friend of mine replaced the clock. As a high school kid, worked up in the tower there and got to replace the lamps. It's real common for there to be holes in there.
That's crazy.
They're always shooting at it, you know, because it's a big target.
Yeah, I suppose.
I have a couple
Yeah,
comments.
please, yeah.
I was excited to see this as part of the program only because I worked at Allen Bradley for a long time. Retired in '99, started there in '62, and I actually knew Harry Bradley, who was alive but ill at the time. And I said to Ed, I said, I wonder how many people know why the Allen Bradley Tower is as big as it is. How many people here know that? It's actually comprised of giant water tanks for fire protection. And that was the initiative, and the small clock tower is also a water tower. If you look at the older buildings in Milwaukee, they got these water tanks that look like rockets. Well, they need that water height for fire protection because the top floor is like 8 stories, whereas the clock tower is higher than that. And so the owners of the company said, well, yeah, we want to make it the largest four-phase clock in the world. And so they did. And a lot of people don't know that, the giant water tanks that are basically in the clock tower. And I was telling Ed, I had the advantage, because of my role in the company, is that I actually had a key to the tower, so I could go up there anytime, and that observation deck is really a great place to be. But there are many offices below the level of the clock face. And some of the executives use that as their place. There's something else about these buildings that isn't clock related that you should know about. If you look at the large building that the clock tower sits on, that was called the office building. That was built in the early 60s. At the time, the Bradley brothers were very energy conscious, and they said, we're going to heat this building, the new office building, with the energy from people, machines, and lighting. No furnaces. And they called it a heat pump, which in those days, in the early 60s, was very, very risque, unusual, but at the end of the day, very expensive. Well, the Bradleys had a lot of money. And so at the time it was built, it was the largest heat pump in northern U.S. ever built. And it started out with, in the basement of that building, are 2 large tanks. Each tank came in on a railroad flat car. That's how big these tanks are. And these tanks are filled with water, and that's used to collect the energy during the daytime from the people, the machines, and the lights. And so at nighttime, the energy is redistributed as heat for the building. When this was originally built, the only heat-producing devices they had was for heating domestic water for restrooms. And of course, I've had the chance to be in all those places many times, but you go in that basement, it's almost like, I can't believe this. I mean, it's